I'd like to begin today with a story about Bob Dylan. It's a story that takes place in the early summer of 1965 when Dylan is just finishing up his tour of England. It's been a grueling few months as Dylan has been struggling to maintain a non-stop performance schedule. He'd first traveled across the Northeast on a bus, playing in small college towns and big city theaters. Then he crossed over the West Coast and crammed in a hectic few weeks of concerts and promotion. He'd been paraded in front of the press and asked an endless series of inane questions, from "What is the truth?" to "Why is there a cat on the cover of your last album?" When Dylan wasn't surly, he was often sarcastic, telling journalists that he collected monkey wrenches, was born in Mexico, that his songs were inspired by chaos, watermelon, and clocks. That last line almost made him smile. By the time Dylan arrived in London, it was clear that the tour was taking a toll. The singer was skinny from insomnia and pills, his nails were yellow from nicotine, and his skin had a ghostly pale pallor. Joan Baez said he looked like an underfed angel. For the first time, his solo shows felt formulaic, as if he were singing the lines of someone else. He rarely acknowledged the audience or paused between songs. He seemed to be in a hurry to get off stage. Before long, it all became too much. While touring in England, Dylan decided that he was leading an impossible life. The only talent he cared about, his ceaseless creativity, was being ruined by fame. The breaking point probably came after a brief vacation in Portugal, where Dylan came down with a vicious case of food poisoning. The illness forced him to stay in bed for a week, giving the singer a rare chance to reflect. "I realized I was very drained," Dylan would later confess. "I was playing a lot of songs I didn't want to play. I was singing words I didn't really want to sing. It's very tiring having other people tell you how much they dig you if you yourself don't dig you." The last shows were in London. It was here that Dylan told his manager he was quitting the music business. He was finished with singing and songwriting. He was going to move to a tiny cabin in Woodstock, New York. Although Dylan had become a pop icon, he was ready to renounce it all. He just wanted to be left alone. Dylan wasn't bluffing. As promised, he returned from his British tour and rode his Triumph motorcycle straight out of New York City. He didn't even bring his guitar. Of course, our story does not end here. Bob Dylan did not retire in 1965. After a few relaxing days in Woodstock, just when he was most determined to stop creating music, he was overcome with a familiar feeling. "It's a hard thing to describe," Dylan would later remember, "just the sense that you got something to say." So Dylan did the only thing he knew how to do. He grabbed a pencil and started to scribble. Once Dylan began, his hand didn't stop moving for the next several hours. "I found myself writing this song, this story, this long piece of vomit, 20 pages long," Dylan said. "I'd never written anything like that before, and it suddenly came to me that this is what I should do." Vomit is the essential word here. Dylan is describing with characteristic vividness the uncontrollable rush of a creative insight, that flow of associations that can't be held back. "I don't know where my songs come from," Dylan said. "It's like a ghost is writing the song. It gives you the song and it goes away. You don't know what it means." In retrospect, we can see that this frantic composition, this vomit of words written in Woodstock by the ghost, allowed Dylan to fully express for the very first time the full diversity of his influences. In these lyrics, we can hear his mental blender at work as he mixes together scraps of Blake, Fellini, Woody Guthrie, and Robert Johnson. The song is modernist and pre-modern, avant-garde and country western. What Dylan did, and this is why he's Bob Dylan, is find the strange thread connecting these different voices. In those first minutes of writing, he found a way to make something new out of this incongruous list of influences, drawing them together into a catchy song. When Dylan gets to the chorus, and he knows this is the chorus as soon as he commits it to paper, the visceral power of his words becomes obvious. "How does it feel to be without a home, like a complete unknown, like a rolling stone?" The following week, on June 15, 1965, Dylan brings the sheaf of papers into the cramped space of Studio A at Columbia Records in New York City. After just 4 takes, the musicians were only beginning to learn their parts. "Like a Rolling Stone" was cut on acetate. Those 6 minutes of raw music would revolutionize rock and roll. The story of Like a Rolling Stone, the reason I'm talking about Bob Dylan today, is because it's a story about a moment of insight. At times, such stories can feel like romantic cliches. They're They're the 1% against the 99%. And they seem like make-believe breakthroughs. You know, it's a story of Archimedes in the bathtub and Newton under the apple tree. And yet insights do happen. That 1% is real. They are a genuine mental event. They really are responsible for the theory of gravity and like a rolling stone. And in recent years, psychologists and neuroscientists have begun to deconstruct this most mysterious of mental moments. And it turns out there are two defining features to moments of insight. The first defining feature is that the answer comes out of the blue. It arrives when we least expect it. So we write our best song after we've moved to Woodstock and quit the singing and songwriting business. The second defining feature is that as soon as the answer arrives, we know this is the answer. This is the solution we've been searching for. It comes attached with this sense of certainty. It feels like a revelation. Now, at first glance, it's not quite clear how one could scientifically study such moments of insight, you know, because you can't just put undergraduates in a brain scanner and say, have an epiphany, we're ready for you. That'd be a very inefficient way to collect data. So instead, scientists had come up with a way to generate lots of moments of insight on the fly, and they settled on a variety of word problems. I'm talking today primarily about the research of Mark Beeman at Northwestern and John Kunios at Drexel. They came up with a set of word problems called compound remote associate problems. The acronym's a bit unfortunate, CRAP. But the problems go like this. I'm going to give you 3 words, and you have to find a 4th word that can form a compound word with these 3 words. So we'll do the first one together. The 3 words are pine, crab, and sauce. The answer in this case is apple, pineapple, crab apple, applesauce. So if apple leaps into consciousness, it's going to feel like a moment of insight. So here's one for you guys. The 3 words are age, mile, and sand. Just shout it out if you get it. Age, mile, and sand. Stone. You guys are pretty good. I guess I shouldn't be too surprised. But so if stone pops into your head, especially if it pops into your head that quickly, it's almost certainly going to feel like a moment of insight. So Beeman and Kunios were able to give these compound remote associate problems to undergraduates in an fMRI machine. And first thing they discovered is that in the seconds before the insight appeared, a part of the brain called the anterior superior temporal gyrus, an obscure bit of the right hemisphere just behind your ear, showed a sharp spike in activity. It's a part of the brain nobody knows too much about. It's been previously associated with things like the processing of jokes and also the interpretation of metaphors. And this begins to make a little sense. You know, when Romeo says that Juliet is the sun, we know he's not saying that Juliet's a big flaming ball of plasma gas. Instead, we realize he's trafficking in metaphor. And it makes sense that in metaphor is by looking past these surface dissimilarities, the fact that Juliet and suns have literally nothing in common. And instead, searching for that remote association, that underlying theme they actually share. So we realize that Romeo is saying that Juliet lights up his world the way the sun lights up ours. Now, something similar is going on when you're trying to make sense of pine, crab, and sauce. Those aren't 3 words that go together very often. In fact, you've probably never used them in a sentence before, and yet what this one brain area in the back of your right hemisphere seems to be very good at is finding that one other word, which in this case is apple, that binds them all together. Now, when you need a moment of insight in the real world, the same mental process is unfolding. I mean, if the connections were obvious, if they were literal, if they were on the surface, you would have found them already. The reason you're floundering about searching for an epiphany is because they're hidden, they're invisible, they're distal, and that's why you need to bring them together. That's the first thing Beeman and Kunios discovered. The second thing they discovered is a bit more interesting, and this they learned when they hooked students up to an EEG machine. That's like wearing a big bulky shower cap full of electrodes, measures the waves of electricity pouring out of your head. And what Beeman and Kunios discovered is that they could predict up to 8 seconds in advance whether or not someone's going to have a moment of insight. So now just think for a second how spooky this is. They could look at your EEG waves and they could say, sorry buddy, you're wasting your time. We could give you all the problems in the world and you wouldn't get anywhere. You should just go home. Or they could say, and in about 7.5 seconds, the odds are looking pretty good. You're probably going to have an epiphany, so brace yourself. The question, of course, is what this predictive signal is. Turns out to be something called alpha waves. Like most things in the mind, alpha waves remain very mysterious, but they are closely associated with states of relaxation. So things that lead to the production of lots of alpha waves are things like daydreaming on the plane, taking a warm shower, having a beer on the couch, going for a walk in the woods, doing whatever it is you need to do that puts your mind at ease, that gets you to stop thinking about those nagging problems at work. Now, the reason these states of relaxation are so important, Beeman and Kunios argues that when we're not relaxed, when we're really focused, Our attention's out here. It's consumed by the noise of the world. We are thinking about pine, crab, sauce, pine, crab, and sauce, and there's probably a wrong answer. A common wrong answer is tree, that we just can't get past. And so we're making no progress. We are stuck and stumped. It's not until we're in the shower being pelted by warm water, begin shampooing our hair, that at long last we're able to turn the spotlight of attention inwards. And that's when we hear that quiet voice coming from the back of our head saying, "The answer is apple. The answer is apple." Maybe that voice has been there for hours or days or weeks. We just haven't taken a moment to listen. Bhima and Kunya show this wonderful story about the time they brought a trained Tibetan Buddhist monk into their labs. Guy meditates for 10 hours a day, so he's got exquisite control over the spotlight of attention. And at first he assumes the way to solve these word puzzles is to focus on them, to think about pine, crab, and sauce. But of course that's the exact wrong approach, and he goes 0 for 30. He can't solve a single one. But then at a certain point he realizes that he's doing it wrong. And so then they watch his alpha waves abruptly increase. He's now focused on not being focused. He has just allowed himself to relax in the moment. And that's when he becomes an insight machine. He solves 26 puzzles in a row, a streak they have never seen before or since. Now, there is something, I think, counterintuitive about this research. I think most people assume that when you give them a hard problem, right, a problem that they just can't solve, a problem that requires a moment of insight, that what we should do is drink a triple espresso, chug some Red Bull, snort some Ritalin, do whatever it is we need to do to stay focused, to chain ourselves to our desk, to lock in on our computer screen. But that turns out to be exactly backwards. Instead, the most productive thing we can do is stop looking for the answer. The answer will only arrive, in fact, after we stop looking for it. This wonderful quote of Einstein's that creativity is the residue of wasted time. When you need an epiphany, you have to make time to waste time. Now, I wish I could stand up here. It would be wonderful to stand up here and just say we don't actually need the 99%. The whole premise of this conference is wrong, that we just should focus on the 1%, just focus on inspiration, and that means going on vacation all the time, taking endless showers, forget work, just play ping pong, just have a beer on the couch. Because just last month a study came out showing that when you get undergrads too drunk to drive, they actually solve 30% more insight puzzles. So maybe that's all we need to do, right? Just have beer and take showers. Of course, that's not the way the world works. We can't always be relaxed. That moments of insight are wonderful, but it really is about the perspiration. Really is about putting in the work. When you talk to creative people, they often begin by telling this very romantic story of the epiphany while shampooing their hair or while on that nature walk. And then if you keep on pestering them, they'll talk about all the hard work that came after that. Even after they had the big breakthrough, they still needed to refine it for the real world. As Nietzsche once observed, creators have a vested interest in our believing in the flash of revelation, the so-called inspiration shining down from heavens as a ray of grace, but this is often a lie. In reality, all great artists and thinkers are great workers. To illustrate his point, Nietzsche described Beethoven's musical notebooks, which documented the composer's painstaking process of refining his melodies. It wasn't uncommon for Beethoven to experiment with 70 different versions of a single musical phrase before settling on the final one. The lesson here is that even Beethoven, the cliché of artistic genius, still needed to constantly refine his ideas, struggling with his music until the beauty shone through. Let's not sugarcoat, this rejecting process is not fun. It's the red pen on the page and the discarded sketch, the trash prototype and the failed first draft. Nevertheless, such a merciless process is sometimes the only way forward. We keep on thinking and paying attention because our next thought might be the answer. So what defines this kind of creativity? What allows some people to go through 70 different iterations of a single musical phrase? What defines the 99%? At first glance, the answer isn't clear. When you look at highly successful creative people, those epic creators on the far right side of the bell curve, Bob Dylan, Pablo Picasso, Steve Jobs, people like that, and you ask yourself, what makes them special? What makes them different from you and me? At first glance, the answer isn't clear at all. You can give them an IQ test, and it turns out that they'll look pretty normal. They're not really smarter than general population. You can give them a battery of old-fashioned personality tests, Myers-Briggs and all the rest, and once again, they'll look pretty ordinary. They may be a little bit more open to experience, a touch more extroverted, but nothing too interesting. Instead, what psychologists have begun to discover in recent years is that, sure enough, they are different from us, and the character trait that sets them apart is a character trait called grit. G-R-I-T. It's not an acronym. It is exactly what it means. Grit is about stubbornness, persistence, single-mindedness. I'm thinking about Edison. I'm thinking about J.K. Rowling, who suffered through 12 rejections from publishers, but kept on writing about that boy wizard in coffee shops while her baby daughter napped. Grit is the stubborn refusal to quit. Now, the best way to tell you about why grit matters is to tell you the story about how the character trait was first discovered. A story that takes place at West Point in 2005. See, West Point had this problem. You go back decades, and West Point had lost about 5% of its cadets within the very first 6 weeks of school. It's a very tough time. You get your head shaved, you go on long runs, you get woken up early. And it's a time known as beast barracks. They're trying to take these soft citizens and turn them into hardened soldiers. And some kids just couldn't take it. And this was a big problem for West Point because there are no transfer students. These are future leaders of the Army who were just quitting, who were dropping like flies. You know, they wanted to groom these kids, but they couldn't. So West Point had searched for years for some way to predict retention in advance, predict who could make it through the very first 6 weeks. Look at SAT scores, measure the physical fitness. They'd done personal one-on-one interviews. Nothing worked. So in desperation, they go to the psychologist named Angela Duckworth at Penn, and they ask her, can you help us? She comes up with a 3-minute survey called the Grit-O survey. It asks questions in 2 different domains. The first domain is, how single-minded are you? Have you always wanted to go to West Point? Have you always wanted to be a poet, a computer scientist, a programmer, an entrepreneur, a sculptor, whatever it is? Is this a goal you've had for a long time? Is this a long-standing passion? Second domain is, how do you react to the inevitable frustrations and failures along the way? Are they a sign that you should double down and try even harder? Are they a sign that, this is the world telling you you're just not good enough? You should find a new goal. Those are the kinds of questions she asked, and what she discovered is that her short Grit-O survey is the first test that allowed West Point to successfully predict in advance who could make it through beast barracks. It's been used every year since, and it works every single year. Now, since 2004, Duckworth has gone on to show that in field after field, grit is often the single best predictor of success. So if you're trying to figure out which 12-year-olds are most likely to win the National Spelling Bee, turns out it's not the smartest ones or the ones with the best grades. It's the ones with the most grit. Why? Because grit mediates deliberate practice. Grit allows us to practice the right way, which is not the fun way. We're trying to figure out which real estate agents are going to make the most sales that year and most likely to stick with the business through the downturn. It's the ones with the highest levels of grit. Which entrepreneurs are going to make the most money 3 years out of Wharton Business School? It's the ones with the highest levels of grit. Which teachers that teach for America are most likely to make it through the first 2 years of teaching in an inner city public school? It's the ones with the highest levels of grit. That grit allows us to keep on going. Now, I would argue that grit is particularly important in the creative domain. And that's because to create something new in the 21st century, in this crowded world of ours, is never going to be easy. It's always going to involve frustration and failure and people telling you you're just not good enough, that this idea will never work, that you should just quit now while you're still ahead. It's going to involve people taking a red pen and marking your draft all over, saying this will never, ever cut it. And in order to make that idea real, in order to keep on putting in the 99%, you're going to have to simply say, I am not going to quit. I believe in this, and I'm going to stick with it. And that requires grit. There's a wonderful quote from Woody Allen that 80% of success is just showing up. Well, grit is what allows us to show up again and again. Now, grit is not just about stubborn persistence, though. There's a second component to grit which is just as important, and that's choosing the right goal in the first place. It's no use persisting, after all, if a goal is truly impossible. While young people get bombarded with well-meaning adults telling them that dreams always come true, that they just need to believe, the unfortunate reality is that not every goal is worth pursuing. I might want to be a professional basketball player. In fact, I do want to be a professional basketball player. But, look at me. It's not going to happen unless I'm honest about my limitations, and I'll waste time chasing a far-fetched future. Because dreams do come true, but first we need to pick the right one. So how can we sort the useful long-term goals from the useless ones? How can we make sure that all of our struggle and practice and sacrifice will be worth it? Well, here's my advice. We should ask ourselves if the goal passes the underwear test. Let me explain. One of the most deep-seated features of the human mind is that it very quickly takes things for granted, becoming numb to the predictable perceptions and pleasures of the world. Just think of your underwear. Do you feel it? Are you conscious of it? Of course not. That's because you've adapted to the feel of underwear, habituated to the touch of cotton on your bum. And this isn't just about underwear. Psychological adaptation also explains why that first bite of chocolate cake is better than the second, and the second is better than the third. It explains why the first time you use that new iPhone, you're pretty excited, but before long, it'll just be another thing in your pocket. And then a few weeks after that, you'll start complaining that your phone can only hold 5,000 songs, or that it downloads streaming videos from the air so slowly. The delight has vanished, replaced by the usual dissatisfaction. This is because our brain is designed to be ungrateful, every pleasure a fleeting thing. Now, what does that have to do with grit and long-term goals? Well, the only dreams worth pursuing are those that pass the underwear test. These are the pursuits that don't bore us even after we put in 10,000 hours plus or minus 5,000 hours of practice. They contain the kind of subtle thrills that don't get old, that we don't adapt to, that keep us motivated and interested for years and years at a time. Sure, there'll be frustrations along the way, but these frustrations won't feel permanent. So what allows us to keep on going, to keep on working and learning and improving. Because that's what it takes to succeed, to accomplish something interesting. Because if the goals ever feel tedious, if they feel as unnecessary as that last bite of chocolate cake, then we're never going to put in the necessary work. Grit requires passion, grit requires love, and love is just another name for what never gets old. Love is the opposite of underwear. That last line sounded a bit more profound when I wrote it last night. So far, I've been attempting to describe these two very distinct forms of creativity which depend on very distinct mental processes in the brain. The more practical lesson, though, is that different kinds of creative problems benefit from different kinds of creative thinking. The question, of course, is how to adjust our thought process to the task at hand. When should we daydream and take warm showers, and when should we drink another cup of coffee? What requires relaxation, and what requires grit? The good news, and this is very good news, is that the human mind has a natural ability to diagnose our problems, to assess the kind of creativity we need. These assessments have an eloquent name. They're called feelings of knowing. And they occur whenever we suspect that we can find the answer if only we keep on thinking about the question. One of my favorite examples of a feeling of knowing is when a word's on the tip of your tongue. You know, you're walking down the street and you see someone and you know their name, but you just can't quite place it. You know, they're an old friend from high school, a distance acquaintance on Facebook. Ugh, it's on the tip of your tongue. It drives me crazy. Yet it's also kind of profound, because how do you know something if you don't actually know it? You know, why are you so convinced that memory's in one of these overstuffed file cabinets if you can't actually find the file? Where here's where these feelings of knowing come in handy. That feeling of knowing is a hunch telling you, if you just keep on searching for that name in 5 minutes or 10 minutes, you will find it. Now, when it comes to solving creative problems, these feelings of knowing are often an essential guide. We can glance at a mystery, it turns out, and know very quickly and with a high degree of accuracy whether or not we can solve that problem within a given time frame. We can say if this problem is worth investing our attention in, if we can actually use the solvent of working memory to help solve it. Now, what makes these feelings of knowing even more useful is they become attached with a sense of progress. This was first demonstrated by Janet Metcalf, a psychologist at Columbia University. She has people working on various creative problems, whether or not they felt like they were getting closer to the solution. And it turned out that when subjects were working on problems that were typically solved in a moment of insight, in one of those blinding epiphanies, they reported no increase in closeness until the insight popped into their head. They went straight from freezing cold to burning hot. There was no feeling of knowing. In contrast, Metcalf found that problems that didn't require insight were answered only after people reported a gradual increase in warmth, which reflected their own sense of progress. Now, what's impressive about such estimates, what's kind of miraculous, is that people were able to assess their closeness to the solution without even knowing what the solution was. It's like being dropped into a strange city. You have no idea where you're trying to go, and yet you're still able to say, if I make this left-hand turn, I'm headed in the right direction. That's what our feelings of knowing are like. Now, this ability to calculate progress is an important part of the creative process. Let's say you've been working on a problem for a long time, and you made a lot of progress. You've advanced. You've gotten closer to the answer. But then all of a sudden, one day, you hit the wall. You no longer feel that you're making progress. There is no feeling of knowing. It's vanished. Turns out at this point, you probably need a moment of insight. In these instances, we should rely on the right hemisphere, which excels at revealing those remote associations. Focusing on the problem will be a waste of mental resources. We will stare at our computer screen and simply repeat our failures. Instead, we should find a way to relax to get those alpha waves going. The most productive thing we can do is forget all about work. However, when those feelings of knowing are telling us that we're getting closer, then we need to keep on struggling to invest in that 99%. We should continue to pay attention until it hurts, to rely on those muscles of grit. Before long, that feeling of knowing will become actual knowledge. The last idea I'd like to end with today is a provocative one, and it speaks directly, I think, to the topic of this conference, to idea execution and just how hard it is. In fact, it suggests that many of the things we do with the best of intentions, our attempts to manage genius, to execute our ideas, to make creativity a property of the real world, that they actually get in the way, they hinder our innovation. This is best demonstrated by the work of Geoffrey West. He's a theoretical physicist at the Santa Fe Institute, and he's probably best known for his work on data mining cities. He gathers vast tracts of data from the Census Bureau and the Patent Office and governments all across the world, and he wants to understand what makes cities tick and why some cities tick better than others. But he makes this very, I think, interesting analogy between cities and companies. He points out that from a certain perspective, cities and companies look quite similar, right? They're both big social organizations in a fixed physical space, lots of infrastructure, and yet cities and companies exhibit one very interesting difference, which is that cities never die. Cities are immortal. Cities live forever. You can nuke a city, comes back. You can flood a city, comes back. Have a devastating earthquake, burn the city to the ground, and we still have San Francisco. Companies, on the other hand, they die all the time. The average lifespan of a Fortune 100 firm is 45 years. Only 2 companies in the original Dow Jones Index are still around. Nearly 25% of Fortune 500 companies, they die every decade. So what's the difference? Why are cities immortal and companies so fleeting? Well, by looking at all these statistics, Geoffrey West has found an interesting difference, and the difference is this: that as a city gets bigger, as the metropolis swells in size, everyone in that city becomes more productive. By every metric we have, they're going to look better and smarter. They're going to make more money. They're going to invent more patents per capita, more trademarks per capita, and so on. This is known as superlinear scaling, so the productivity chart looks like this. And it's why urbanization is the great theme of the 21st century. It's why more people are going to move to cities in the next 100 years than have moved to cities in all of human history. Because when we cram ourselves together, we have more ideas. When we bump into each other on the sidewalk while waiting in line for a latte, all those bumps, they add up. It is the serendipity of the city that keeps it alive. Companies, on the other hand, look very different. As a company gets bigger, everyone in that company becomes less productive. So you see less profit per employee, fewer patents per employee, fewer trademarks per employee, and so on. And this is the problem, right? Because Wall Street's always saying, grow the bottom line, keep on getting bigger. And so that's what companies do. They try to expand. And so now they've got expanded fixed costs. It's expensive bureaucracy to maintain, but they're no longer innovating at the same rate. So they become more reliant on their old ideas. They've got to invest in expensive acquisitions for the new ideas. And eventually those old ideas don't work. Those acquisitions don't pan out. And that's when companies go belly up. That is why companies die. Now, what explains this difference? Why are cities superlinear while companies are sublinear? Well, West argues it's because companies get in the way. That the magic of a city is it's a freewheeling, chaotic place. A mayor can't tell you where to live or who to talk to or what problems to work on. It's just a bunch of strangers bumping into each other. Cities don't try to maximize creativity, which is precisely why they do. Now, companies, on the other hand, They try to micromanage the process. They tell us to brainstorm when brainstorming doesn't work. They tell us to not drink a beer in the afternoon. They tell us to always focus, to chain ourselves to our desk. They stifle horizontal interactions and become these very vertical places. They silo knowledge, and all these things, they hold us back. So West's advice is simple. When in doubt, imitate the city. In closing, the imagination has always seemed like a magic trick of matter, which is probably why we've always blamed our best ideas on the muses. We've outsourced our talent to the fickle gods. The good news is that by finally understanding where our new ideas come from, we can hopefully have a few more of them. The science of creativity can make us just a little bit more creative. But we must also be honest. The creative process will never, ever be easy, no matter how much we know about neurons or cities. The science of the imagination doesn't fit neatly on a PowerPoint slide, and it can't be summarized in a subtitle. If creativity were that easy, Bob Dylan wouldn't be so famous, and the creative process wouldn't require so much grit. Despite all the clever studies and rigorous experiments, our most essential talent remains our most mysterious. The mystery is this. Although the imagination is inspired by the everyday world, by its flaws and beauties, we are somehow able to see beyond our sources, to imagine things that only exist in the mind. There was nothing, now there's something. It's almost like magic. Thank you all so much for listening today. Thank you very, very much.